If you guys have been following my last few interviews, you will see a pattern emerging. I have been exploring what exactly is the intellectual dark web. Some people say it's a group of people, some say it's a way of doing discourse. Today, I had a chat with Jonathan Kay. He is the editor for the Canadian division of Quillette, and he was so gracious to give me a little bit of his time this evening. He wrote an article. It came out, or I think he wrote it yesterday, and I read it today, and I was able to speak with him about what he thinks about the intellectual dark web. It's, I guess, May 8th is its year anniversary. So what is it? And he talks about this as in the introduction of his article. It's rather unclear what the intellectual dark web is. And so he characterizes it as a set of ideas. So actually, let me read the title of his article. The intellectual dark web, a year old. Do we know what it is yet? And then the subtitle is, we've met its renegades, but what about its preoccupations? John really, he talks about sort of the background as to how this group formed and why, which I like that. I like historical context. I'm a history person. So he goes through the circumstances as to, he describes it even as a more like an exodus than a genesis, which I found that very fascinating to think of it in such terms. And then he moves on to talk about, well, what is an intellectual dark web thinker? An intellectual dark web thinker thinks in this way, acts in this way. So that's really the article. So then I talk with him about his article, and ask questions that I have surrounding the IDW. And it was just really great to have him shed some light on what he thinks about this movement. I hope you guys like it. I'd like to chat with John again and for longer. Yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments. And oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe if you like what you see. Okay, hi John. Thank you so much for chatting with me today.
No problem.
So I read your article on the intellectual dark web today, and I have questions.
Sure.
So can you tell me what, I guess, inspired you to write it at this point in time?
So it's been a year since the term IDW was popularized by Barry Weiss in the New York Times. She didn't invent the term. It was invented by somebody else. And people have been talking about it. And also, the last few weeks, there's been, I don't know what the term is. I guess you could say there's a little bit of like arguing, bickering, discussion about what the IDW is, who's in, who's out. I think to a certain extent that's a positive sign. Like,
okay.
What's a brand that's valuable enough for people to argue about who's in or who's out, right? Like, if the designation didn't mean anything, then no one would care who is in or who is out. And of course, like, I think some people use it as a term of abuse. There are people on Twitter who see IDW as a negative term, but there's also people who see it as a positive thing.
Right. So I never thought of it that way, that it's good that there is arguing about it, but that makes sense. It's, if you didn't care, you wouldn't be bickering about it. So your subtitle, actually, I find really interesting. Well, I guess so the title is A Year Old, Do We Know What It Is Yet? And then the subtitle is We've Met Its Renegades, but what about its preoccupations? Can you explain that a little bit to me?
So I think there have been articles about the so-called intellectual dark web, but a lot of them are essentially profiles of people who are leading members of the IDW, and I think you probably know who they are as much as me. It's like Jordan or Dave Rubin or Sam Harris, and they're very interesting, but they are largely consisting of capsule summaries of what a particular person thinks. And you might stitch 5 or 6 of them together. That's kind of what Barry Weiss did.
Yeah.
She did it artfully in that New York Times piece. And I've seen other pieces like that. I think Politico has done it. Well, Politico did it, I think, at one point at least, in the form of a profile of my boss at Quillette. Her name's Claire Lehman.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually wasn't interested in that at all because I think it's very interesting what Sam Harris thinks or what Claire Lehman thinks or Michael Shermer or all these people. But I'm more interested in the set of ideas that binds them together, and
Okay.
that's what I attempted to do with my piece.
Yeah, yes, because I have been actually interviewing people just because I'm interested to say what is the IDW, and then I'm looking at different people's opinions, and I've interviewed a few where it's a protocol, where it's a way of doing discourse, but mostly people do think it's a group of that smaller group of academics that you mentioned. So yeah, could you go into what you kind of talk about them in terms of how did they come together in the first place? These ideas that binds these people. You kind of do background, which I found really interesting, and then you talk about like IDW thinkers. But can we start first with the sort of circumstances that the IDW was formed or born into?
So one of the points I make in the article is that a lot of people who consider themselves IDW, or whom I consider IDW, even if they don't self-identify that way, probably more than most movements, it's a case of people becoming frustrated or disenchanted with other movements.
Mm-hmm.
They're conservatives who no longer are conservative, or they're liberals who no longer are liberals, and the way they leave their original ideological home, if you want to call it, very much comes to define their way of thinking. So, like the example I gave, and I think a lot of other people would give, is this guy Brett Weinstein, who was at Evergreen State University on the West Coast, and he was very liberal in his politics, but of course, famously 2 years ago, there was this event on campus where all the white people had to leave campus, and he refused to take part in that, and he was mobbed. I mean, physically mobbed, and it wasn't just a bunch of people on Twitter or whatnot. And so that experience, which his wife also endured to some extent, he was also a professor, like very much came to affect him. And I think if you talk to him, I've never met him, but if you talk to him, the way he tweets, and he's been on interviews, he'll never be the same person ideologically, because he saw that face of progressivism. He saw a very ugly face of progressivism. By the same token, I think there's people like me. For 16 years, I worked at a fairly conservative newspaper in Canada, and I wouldn't say I saw an ugly face of conservatism, but I definitely saw strands of conservatism that I disagreed with. I saw people whose attitude towards science didn't match my own. Some of them are people who would be called global warming skeptics, or something worse than that. And that experience definitely made me conscious of all the ways that I wasn't a conservative. At one point I'd consider myself like a card-carrying conservative, and for a whole bunch of reasons I don't, including the reason that when I was in that environment, it just became clear to me how different I was in certain respects. And I think there's a lot of people like that. I think almost everybody in the IDW universe has some story of feeling like they don't fit in with conventional ideological or political movements. And that feeling of not fitting in, of fleeing something or defining yourself out of a larger traditional grouping, that more than most movements defines the IDW. It's not like Marxism, to take like an extreme example, is based on this set of precepts created by a guy named Karl Marx, right? The same is true, if you're, I don't know, you're a Straussian, or you follow the precepts of Milton Friedman. There's plenty of doctrines out there that are based in a positive way. Ayn Rand, Randians follow the precepts of Ayn Rand, they're libertarian. Or Edmund Burke, Burkean 19th century, or I guess precedes that, Burkean, so-called Burkean conservatives, they're they'll read the books of Edmund Burke and say, okay, that's what I believe. And IDW isn't like that at all. It's as I say, it's more defined by the things that you find alienating or intellectually disingenuous about other movements.
Okay, so how would you say people seem to think it's a political movement, and you write about how it's upstream of politics. Can you?
So, okay.
Yes. Can you go into that?
Well, I don't think any movement could be said to be completely apolitical. Even literary movements there's always some political dimension. And I wouldn't say that IDW is apolitical.
Okay.
I would say that, and I wrote this in my article. I would say that, by my observation, most of the people who identify as IDW, they're not primarily interested in politics. So,
right.
They read the newspapers or however people get their news. But when they see some story about, the Republicans and the Democrats, unlike somebody who's a real political animal and is obsessed with politics, their first thought isn't, this party is dumb and that's smart and this congressman needs to be voted out and they're more interested in this political platform seems to be popular now, even though I know it's wrong, or this political platform seems to be unpopular, even though I know it's right. What's going on in social media or in communications or in the currents of political tribalism that is causing people to think this or to support this? I'd say people in the IDW are unusually interested in sort of like what I would call the meta issues of politics. Tribal identities, what people get angry about. People use social media, especially, and even more obscure subjects like, how does evolutionary psychology relate to the way they pick political parties or how they choose how they get their media.
Right.
So when I say upstream from politics, I mean, technology, media, science, culture, and all those things feed into politics. And it's not a one-way street. Politics also feeds back into culture, right? Like Trump is a political phenomenon, but it's also affects our culture. So it's not just like a one-way street. But unlike, so this is something that distinguishes, like if you follow the Twitter account of someone like Sam Harris or Michael Shermer or me or Claire or pretty much almost everyone who writes for Quillette regularly, it's pretty rare that like they're going to do any kind of like detailed analysis of, who's going to win a senatorial race in some state, or they're going to rank their, Republican congressmen on their attitude toward gun control. Like that. It tends not to be something that interests them. Just not interested in gun control. They're just they're not interested in the everyday grist of political discourse as it expresses itself in discussions about partisan politics.
And I definitely agree with you there. Why do you think people try to paint them as, I guess, political pundits?
I think first of all, I think everybody, when you believe passionately in something, we often revert to tribalism, like Christians versus Muslims or other cultures or conservatives versus liberals. Like it's something everybody falls back on. It's a very common thing. I'm sure I do it all the time. And politics gives us a vocabulary for discussing that. If you are someone who considers yourself a liberal or a progressive, and you think liberal ideas are good and progressive ideas are good, and somebody says something that rankles you or that you think is wrong, to say, oh, that person's a conservative or they have a conservative agenda or they're alt-right, it's a shorthand that says that's bad. And conservatives do that too. Whenever Obama did something that my conservative friends didn't like, it was just like, oh, that's he's a socialist, or he hates America. Like this politics. One of the reasons people gravitate toward politics is it gives them this language to describe their emotional responses to ideas or people or movements they don't like.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons that people will use political terminology to discuss IDW ideas that aren't inherently political.
Okay, because it's easier, basically.
It's also there's the other thing is people look at like the ramifications of ideas. So, if an IDW person, I don't know the noun form of an like. I don't. It's not like someone from Halifax is a Haligonian. I don't
No,
know.
IDWer, like.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty awkward.
Yeah, so, that is really awkward.
Like let's say someone who identifies IDW says, when it comes to men and women, I believe that on average, men are more interested in math and physics, mm-hmm. and women are more interested in going to law school or becoming doctors. Mm-hmm. I think there's some evolutionary basis to the fact that men prefer being engineers and women prefer being lawyers. That is not a political statement, right? That's maybe they're talking about evolutionary psychology or they're talking about the health sciences or whatever. But a person will look at that and say, okay, what are the consequences of that statement? The consequences of that statement are you're going to be an opponent of affirmative action policies in STEM because you're okay with the fact that engineering is like 70% male. And so what happens, they sort of skip a step and they go to the political ramifications of something. And I don't blame them for doing that, right? Like if I hear somebody say, if I hear somebody make a scientific argument that global warming is a incredibly serious problem and it's going to destroy the Earth, mm-hmm. that's a scientific hypothesis. It's not a political statement. But 90% of people are going to interpret that as a political statement because the next step, of course, is we need to enact policies that curtail industrial activity and help lower the world's temperature. So with just the way our brains are wired, because we're so used to people making these arguments, as soon as we hear like the first step in the argument, we fill in the blanks and we assign a political value to it based on what we expect the political payoff will be, 2 or 3 logical steps down the line. Right. And usually to justify it. Like usually it doesn't always that way. Like, the guy who says global warming is an incredibly serious problem and it's going to be a complete catastrophe. In theory, he could say, and there's nothing we can do about it, so let's just, let's not do anything. Let's just have a lot of fun. Like, no, in theory, he could say that. No one actually does say that, but we just assume that the person's going to make an argument for a carbon tax or something like that.
Right. Oh, okay. That's really interesting that we kind of fill in the gaps and like you said, skip steps.
Well, we go straight to the argument. Like people have gone through, they see this so often on social media or in politics that it's like, they're like, well, I know how this ends. And as I say, usually they're right. Like usually people don't just go around and randomly talk about global warming. Usually when they talk about global warming, they have some purpose in mind.
Okay, so I'm even like going back to your original idea regarding the men in physics and women maybe practicing medicine or law. So thinking of James Damore, he was just literally answering a question and not skipping steps like other people did when they reacted to his memo that he sent Google. Is that sort of what?
Well, James Damore, I think you're half right. Like, okay. He was principally interested in answering the question, like, why is there this apparent sex-based bias in terms of career selection and questions to that. But in his memo, his memo wasn't completely agnostic to what people should do. Like he said, we should stop trying to ram a square peg into a round hole, and we should try our options. And people gloss over this part, but I think he at least briefly sketched out some ideas for, well, how can we make this or that group feel more comfortable without being so heavy-handed about it. So I think you're half right. He was mostly interested in the science, but he also had more than a passing interest in what sort of policies could happen.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, actually, I didn't even think about that, so
It was
I
a little
have
bit. It
to
was
go
a
over it
minor.
again.
I think in broad strokes, you're probably right.
Okay. So I actually was wondering then, what do you think about the, particularly for Yuri Harris's article, sort of criticizing the IDW for not going after the conservative side more? And you mentioned in your own article how they're exerting themselves against the left, or I guess the social justice left right now. That's where their efforts are focused. So what do you think about sort of the critique about not going after the I guess the more alt-right conservative, I'm thinking, is what is meant in that, and the fact that they're focusing on the, I guess, far left right now.
So I don't want to focus directly on Yuri Harris's article because he wrote two articles,
Right.
and I think I can address the issue without speaking directly to the article. So my sense is that people who are in the IDW, they hate being told what to think. They hate being told, well, you can't say this, you can't think that, you can't research this. And as a result, they have a tendency to rebel against whoever is in charge or purports to be in charge of any sphere of intellect or research, right? So, if you had an IDW person who was, this is like a thought experiment, working as a cardinal in the Vatican, they would probably rebel against the Catholic Church. They would say, well, I believe in evolution and I don't believe in creationism and I believe in abortion. They would be seen as a leftist because they couldn't keep their mouth shut. They have active brains and they hate being censored. Right now, in intellectual circles, universities, activist circles, literary communities, that sort of thing, the dominant intellectual trend is left of center.
Okay.
And so if you're a professor at a university, or you work at a newspaper or magazine or something like that, or a research institute, to the extent you get in trouble, or to the extent people are telling you, oh, you can't say that, you can't do that, it's probably going to be somebody on the left who's trying to tell you that.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we also, if you're in the United States, you also live in a society where the president is a Republican, right? And there's all sorts of people in politics, I know some of them, who have left politics in Washington because some political appointee told them that they couldn't say this or do this. They were stifled by conservative forces. And this is one of the reasons things are so divisive in the United States right now, is that you have a political sphere, which, including in many state governments, is controlled by conservative. But when intellectual institutions in society are controlled by progressives. So every day the progressives become more and more enraged because they say, Washington is occupied by this conservative president and this sucks and we have to fight back, we have to be more militant. And then you have conservatives who, they control the Senate and they control the presidency and they control the majority of state governments. They take the opposite view and they're like, we have to use our political power to fight political correctness and to fight transgender bathrooms and to fight Hollywood and to fight all these horrible things that are happening in the media and all these horror stories we see on campuses and Antifa. So depending on which side you look, but the thing is, most IDW people are intellectual and they're not politicians. They don't work for a red state government. They work at places like Harvard and Yale and Brown and Middlebury College. And as a result, in their day-to-day lives, to the extent they come up against speech codes or taboos or whatnot, it's almost always progressive speech coaching. It's progressive taboos or progressive, mobbings on social media. Uh, right? So because IDW is largely a movement among intellectuals, they are responding to the side that's winning the culture war in intellectual circles, which is the progressives.
Right.
You've probably seen the statistics that on university campuses, the ratio of self-identified liberals to self-identified conservatives is, I don't know, 10 to 1 or 15 to 1, whatever it is. And that's what they're rebelling against. I tell people, say, if you wanna see the person who wants to impose censorship on everybody else, it's not a liberal impulse or a conservative impulse. It's the person who's winning the culture war. Because if you're winning the culture war, you want to tell everyone to shut up because you're like, okay, I'm winning, now everyone shuts up. Like, let's lock in my victory. And so 30 or 40 years ago, when conservatives were on top during the Reagan years, it was conservatives who were winning the cultural war, and they wanted to stop flag burning, and they wanted to prevent people from teaching homosexuality and all sorts of things. They wanted doctors, and they've successfully prevented doctors from discussing the presence of a gun in a household. There's still a law to that effect, at least in some states. I think Florida, where and that's those conservatives who did that, and they control the legislature, and the person who's in control is usually the person who's promoting censorship. And right. School, but it's not a left-right thing. I always hear all these people say, "Oh yeah, liberals, they just want to censor everything." No, it's not liberals. The conservatives will be just as bad as, 50 years from now, if conservatives control the university, they'll be just as bad. And there'll be some IDW, or version of the IDW that fights back against it. But right now, the commanding heights of the intelligentsia is controlled largely by progressives, and so they're the people in the IDW fight back against.
Right. And now, I guess to veer into the progressives situation, it does, I don't even know where to go with thinking, how can we help with that movement to, I guess, reform it, because of the very fact that you can't even argue because that is a form of oppression. Or not argue, sorry, I have discourse or a dialogue or debate. So and that's, I guess, what the IDW is concerned with right now, because that is where the postmodern sort of dogma has led that side. And I don't really know, like, what do we do with that?
Well, this is a huge subject of conversation. The term I prefer to use is medicalizing discourse. Okay. So, like, if I say to somebody, I don't know, say, I don't like dogs. I don't think we should allow dogs on campus because I don't like dogs. And somebody says, oh my God, I love dogs. I grew up with dogs. You're causing me psychic pain. I can't even have this discussion because it makes me feel unsafe and all this stuff. They're medicalizing the discourse. So they're saying, it's not even that I object to your ideas. It's that being exposed to your ideas is like being exposed to pepper spray or something, or mace. Like, your ideas are kind of like this toxic contaminant that's filling the air. And that's something that's new. Like, that didn't exist when I was a kid. So some people just consider that a debating tactic, and it's an effective debating tactic. Like, if you're talking about trans rights and somebody says, well, I think, I don't know, make some argument about trans rights versus women's rights, and they say, you're denying my humanity, and it's like you're trying to drive me to extinction with your words. It's like you're comparing rhetoric to sort of Holocaust or something, and it's a very effective debating tactic. And sometimes I think it's used cynically. What Jonathan Haidt and his co-author, whose name I can never properly pronounce.
Is it Greg Lukianoff?
Yeah, from FIRE.
Yeah.
So what they argued, I'm sure you know this, they argued in that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, they said, well, it's not entirely cynical. Like, a lot of these kids grew up in households where they didn't have a lot of stress, and helicopter parents, as soon as anything bad went wrong, there was an authority figure they could go to. And so it's not these kids' fault, because when they're in the, have like a genuinely medical response, because that's part of their upbringing. They're just not used to any kind of pushback on their ideas and stuff like that. So that's one of the theories. The theory is that it's a product of their upbringing. And the other theory is that this, universities have become like all about customer service. And so, as soon as any kid on university campus says, I feel unsafe or whatever, like immediately the administrators coddle that kid. And so there's, I won't go into the details, but this is an active subject of conversation among many of the people who are members or presumed members of the IDW, is like, how does this problem arise and what can we do about it?
So in your opinion, can, I guess, anyone become like an IDW thinker? That's how you describe, I guess, members of the IDW in your piece. I think you call them IDW thinkers. So, like, could I be an IDW thinker? Are you an IDW thinker?
Well, it's kind of like, could I be a Marxist? Of course you can be a Marxist. You just have to embrace Marxism. It's not like, there's no blood test or anything. It's and there's no accrediting body. I'd say it's a set of ideas. Mm-hmm. And my piece was trying to define those ideas. And in some cases, as I said, I'm not even sure. I mean, in some cases, it really is about ideas. Like, I think free speech and rationalism and due process, all that sort of stuff. I think, those are real values, and I think that's part of it. But part of it is just like this approach, and it's all, or like an instinct that you just have this antenna that's up for anything that seems cultish, or you hate mobs. You're just suspicious of somebody telling you, you have to use this hashtag, or you have to vote for this person. Like, you're just, part of the IDW thing is a sort of instinctive allergy to certain kinds of like highly tribalized behavior. Okay. And I'm not even sure that qualifies as like an idea. It's more like it's almost like a reflex.
Oh, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I explain it by reference to what we were talking about, like at the very beginning, where a lot of IDW people have been thrown out of other movements, or maybe not thrown out. Maybe they left other movements because, they found they were dogmatic. They found like, to be a good progressive, you have to believe these 47 things, and you have to use these 18 different kinds of hashtags, and or to be a good Republican, you have to support Trump on all these things, and on both sides, people say, no, I can't do that. I don't want to do that. And then they get fed up. Mm-hmm. They throw the sponge in the bucket and they leave. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, and I think this is certainly true of me, they become suspicious whenever anybody for any movement says, well, you have to believe this or you have to believe that. Like, they have this habit of mind born of experience. Mm-hmm. It's something they had before. It's part of their personality, but they don't like being told they have to wear badges or. I'm sure you're much too young. Did you ever watch Seinfeld?
Yeah, no, I'm 33, so I did watch Seinfeld.
Okay, well, so maybe your grandparents showed you the Seinfeld episode where Kramer was at some march for AIDS, and someone said you have to wear the ribbon. It was like an AIDS ribbon. Uh-huh. This is like 30 years ago, right? Before, now there's ribbons for everything, but anti-AIDS events were some of the first places where people were wearing ribbons. Mm-hmm. And he, for whatever reason, he says, no, I'm not going to wear the ribbon. I don't want to wear this ribbon. Mm-hmm. And these two guys were like, why don't you want to wear the ribbon? And it became like this meme of like, whenever anybody wasn't playing along with this stuff, it was, why won't you wear the ribbon? And I think if I had to summarize the way a lot of IDW thinkers think, there is a lot of that thing where it's just, I don't want to wear the ribbon. Yeah, and even though obviously that's a good example, the Seinfeld example, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously everybody wants to find a cure for AIDS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
when, I can't believe I'm quoting Kramer, but when Kramer didn't want to wear the ribbon, it's not because he didn't want to, he opposed the idea of fighting AIDS. He just opposed the idea of somebody making him wear a ribbon to fight AIDS, right? And I think
Okay.
that's sort of a lot of people I know who are sick of, like most progressive ideas. Like I'm pretty progressive on most things. I go down the line, like a pro-choice and anti-death penalty and all this stuff. It's mostly like the methods and the enforcement technique and the witch hunting and stuff that I don't like.
Okay,
Um,
and that's reminding me about what you're saying, how it was the conservatives in, I'd say, like the Reagan era, or I actually was even thinking like with regards to like McCarthyism and having lists of, card carrying communists.
so okay, so I'm going to have to get off the phone in a minute or two, but I'm
Okay.
glad you mentioned McCarthyism because this is a very important example.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to set it out, but so during the McCarthyist era, one thing that happened is that in certain states, if you were a lawyer and you wanted to get accredited as a lawyer through the Bar Association, you had to do this thing where you had to pledge allegiance that I am not a communist.
Oh.
Like it was sort of like anti-communist loyalty oath,
Uh-huh.
and this issue was litigated constitutionally because a lot of lawyers said this is ridiculous. To become a lawyer, I shouldn't have to swear that I'm not, a communist or a member of the Communist Party or whatnot. Like it's compelled speech.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even many people who were communists objected to it. And over time, these I think they were called loyalty oaths or I think a different name, but they were struck down because people found them offensive. It said
Mm.
and properly so. Like I hate communism, but if somebody said, "Will you swear that you're not a communist?" I wouldn't swear that. It's wrong to make me swear that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we saw a recurrence of this on the other side of the spectrum because in Ontario, the equivalent of the bar, I guess, is the Law Society of Ontario.
Mm-hmm. I have heard about this, yeah.
Right. So it's called the Statement of Principles, and they force lawyers to, I consider it compelled speech. They
Mm-hmm.
force lawyers to every year to write the statement, testifying to the effect that they support diversity, equality, and inclusion,
Inclusion. Mm-hmm.
and they're gonna be active in promoting those values and such. Everybody supports diversity, inclusion, and equality, including me.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what we don't support is um, compelling people to, it's like taking the Pledge of Allegiance. Like I pledge that I will be a good diversity soldier.
Mm-hmm.
That's offensive to me. And in the last few days, so the results were released of the latest. They're called the bencher elections. So benchers are the people who run the Law Society of Ontario.
Oh, okay.
And there was this is very parochial, but it's interesting to me. So you had this whole slate of candidates for the bencher election who called themselves anti-SOP, so anti-statement of principles.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who said, if elected as bencher, we are going to eliminate the statement of principles requirement. We're not necessarily going to tear down the whole pro-diversity apparatus embedded within the regulations of the Law Society, but we're going to get rid of this one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the 22 anti-SOP candidates who ran, all 22 were elected. Like it
Oh.
was, yeah, it's actually like to my mind like a great story.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, and I'm super happy about that because to me it's an example of how, a good principle, like anti-communism is a good principle, diversity is a good principle, but forcing people to spew anti-communism and forcing people to support diversity are bad. And so that, to my mind, like this is the sort of thing. I don't know if it's called, civil liberties or classical liberalism. These are terms that are sometimes used overlapping with IDW.
Mm-hmm.
But that to me would be like a core thing that an IDW person would believe that you shouldn't compel speech.